I came home from high school one day and was looking through community news. There were all these suburban journals, and there was a little one called Community News. I'm flipping through their Don Fetty music, 50s or 1950s, whatever. It said Les Paul Jr., $75. And I called the guy who I was playing with in high school, whose dad and grandfather, you know, underwrote an actual 59 Sunburst Les Paul, and his 335 that's worth, whatever, $40,000 now. I'm thinking gold top with two of those cream coiled pickups in it. Jumped in my 67 Chevelle, tore out Olive to Fetty's out in Creve Coeur, ran in there, and that was one of those deals where, unlike my store, they had the guitars hanging at angles with those horrible wire type hangers that dug into the headstocks. And I kept looking, I'm looking for a gold top. I'm going down there and I'm like, kept going. And then I finally saw something, finally went, well, because there's so many guitars lined up and they were so close to, like that far apart. Finally started looking at the headstocks and spotted a Gibson one with the gold, name on it, and walked up, took it down. It was dark brown to yellow, flat top, one big black pickup, and somebody had taken a pin or something and scratched the model off of it, so it just said Les Paul and then the scratched up area. We didn't know anything. The only way you could find out anything about this stuff back then, there were no books, was to look through the old catalogs or actually buy the guitars, open them up, take the parts off, look around. So here's this junior, as it turned out, and I remember Life magazine did a feature on Woodstock, and Leslie West was in Mountain and played Woodstock with a guitar like mine, a single Conaway Sunburst Junior. And I went nuts. I went, oh my God, somebody else has one. And but I made time payments on it, like $15 or so a week, until I got it paid off. And there was a show at Washington U Fieldhouse. It was Paul Butterfield Blues Band. Somebody else opened it, I think a Swedish band. And then Jethro Tull, who was already on their second album, but wasn't, Casey was playing them a lot, but they weren't big yet. Not here. And so, they did, that was sort of typical, especially for the British bands, to do college gigs. Allman Brothers, when I met Dwayne and Dickie initially, was at Brewer Fieldhouse in Columbia, February 28th, 1971, and I was able to pin down a date via John Neiman's concerts book, because one of the things that's incredible that he got was an ABC booking, which was Irving Azoff, who's been one of the biggest people in the rock music industry for decades now, managing the Eagles and God knows who else, and was president, maybe still is, was, whatever, president of Ticketmaster and one of the labels, but he was just this little, I think, chemistry major from Champaign-Urbana when I met him, when he was out on the road with Ario when they were still an opening act and playing bars. But anyway, so I had bought this Junior. I had paid it off, and one of the guys who was from maybe Baldwin, I think, was working for Butterfield, and he had found out that Jason Wilkins, who I played with in high school, and I both had Juniors, and he told Martin Barr about them. And to fast forward, 3:00 in the morning, I'm a 17-year-old kid, and I've got the lead guitars for Jethro Tull in my car. I've been driving for, a year and a half? What the hell happens if I have an accident? And, it was this kid looking over at him going, what am I doing? This is nuts. And we went to Jason's parents' house next to Ladue High School, And the drummer, Clive Bunker, bought Jason's Jr. for whatever he sold it for, 100 or 100 and a quarter, I don't even know. But, it was a double cutaway cherry one. But I couldn't, we're going, well, I can't, my dad hates guitars in the first place. We can't show up at my parents' house at 3 o'clock in the morning and do this. We'll have to, ship it later. So I ended up getting ripped off on that one. But anyway, so Martin Barre ended up with the guitar and recorded all but 2 songs on Aqualung with it, which was their biggest hit and, biggest tour that they ever did, as far as I know. But they went from, playing college campuses like the Allman Brothers were to selling out hockey arenas. But if you listen to, Aqualung, or I don't know what other songs you'd hear off of that album. I had no intention of selling it, which was the first of many of them. I mean, the biggest one that happened that way was after Joe Walsh had joined the Eagles. I took my 2 Sunburst Les Pauls, 2 59s, down to Stouffer's that afternoon to show those and whatever else I brought down to Don Felder and Joe. And I've actually got pictures of Joe sitting, and they're in one of the guitar books. I think it's in Beauty of the Burst, Yasuhiko Iwandi's book, which is, the first really well-known higher demand one, especially if you got a hardcover one, because there were only 1,000 of them done for worldwide distribution. But Joe really liked this one burst that had been Gary Richrath of REO's first one. I can send you pictures. Definitely when Gary first had it, when it was still Cherry Sunburst and, playing it outdoors. And he had actually gone to pawn shops in Peoria, and one pawn shop had 5 Sunburst Les Pauls. And he picked out the nicest one back in, I think he said 69, and he bought it for $90 plus sales tax. REO's first sold out show was Kiel Auditorium, where they were headlining. And before the show, Gary and I did a trade deal. I traded him a mint condition 59 burst with tiny frets in it, which I couldn't play well. And they transitioned during 1959. But, and his had gone from this beautiful Cherry Sunburst Les Paul to just beaten into oblivion. It had a Bigsby on it at some point. Had to have the bridge holes moved, because they'd worn through, all that stuff plugged. But Worthington had been on the road, I think at that point, restoring statues for a Washington U crew. It took 2 years start to finish to get that guitar redone, but that became actually one of the more famous bursts out of 40 that I've sold. One a dealer buddy up in La Crosse got in a 234-piece collection that I brokered. But Joe was going, well, I'd really like to buy this. And we ended up doing the deal at the all-night coffee shop at Stouffer's that they had at that point. I think it was 4 o'clock in the morning when we finally did it. And Joe's talk box had, sort of backed up on him. Something went wrong with it and blasted out an eardrum. And he was, think jamming a drumstick into your eardrum. And I think that's the way he described it, that he was just in horrendous pain. And I finally agreed to it. And he goes, I'll be back shortly. Went upstairs to Richard Fernandez's room. And I will say Richard gets my vote for best road or tour manager who I've ever encountered. I was calling the hotels, to get to your point, in the afternoon. And at that point, in summer of 1970 and beyond, the bands were still registering under their own names. And the one that terrified me was Jeff Beck had been one of my guitar heroes since I was 15, without going into that story. And I cold called him when I was 19 years old. He was on town with the BBA tour that he did. And I called him up and said, well, I'm Ed Seelig, and, I didn't have the store yet, and I sell vintage Gibson, Fender, Gretsch, Martin guitars. Old, and he goes, "Oh, I was hoping that you'd call." And he goes, I think he said, "Steve Marriott is a friend of mine, and he told me about you, and I was really hoping you'd call." This is Jeff Beck. Tell me this stuff. So, he was really, friendly and talkative, and said, "Oh yeah, come down." I want one of those early '50s Telecaster body, basses. The earliest form of precision basses that had been reissued as tele basses. But I ended up going to the show, but didn't go backstage because I didn't feel well that night. And that's certainly an issue. Is if you're sick, boy, you don't go backstage because you can end up wrecking a tour for a band doing that. I would show up with like 5 to 10 guitars, and there's at least a page in Ian Hunter of Mott the Hoople's book where he goes, "This guy Ed and his friend showed up, and I was trying to buy a Firebird and offered him $12 and he wasn't having it." I just reread that, and actually just gave Charles Berry Jr., Chuck's son, a copy of it because he, for whatever reason, is a huge Mott the Hoople fan, which I would have never expected. I mean, I know that he likes the same bands that most of the people in my age group did, with the stamping Chuck Berry, and, he was, his big bands that he loved: Stones, Beatles, Cream, Hendrix, and then whoever else. And one of the things that, further developed my friendship with him was when Chuck and then Junior and Ingrid, the older daughter, were playing at Blueberry Hill and at the pageant occasionally. Butch, aka Junior or Charles, was always getting bugged for passes. People were always wanting to get guest listed. But starting in '99, when there was a Bad Company reunion, and Mick Ralphs from Mott the Hoople was lead guitarist for Bad Company, and I had met him on the first Mott tour where they were opening for Emerson, Lake and Palmer here at the Opera House, and the ELP guys just were abusive. I mean, were horrible to him, and they're going, "Oh, we're only getting paid $125 a piece a week, and these guys are all horrible to us, and it's just a nightmare." And ultimately, it turned out that Hunter wrote a book, Diary of a Rock Star, and I bought it back when it came out, and it turned out that he's, speaking of ADD, or either that or poor editing. I mean, he's all over the place with St. Louis and Kansas City, and the mafia management coming in from New York, although he doesn't use that term, but I know who he's talking about because a lot of the British bands were managed by these same two literally mob guys we're talking guns backstage, the whole deal, as I saw firsthand once. And, it's one of those things. I've got 53 years of stories. I started to get to the point and started guest listing him. And the first one was an actual Bad Company original lineup reunion. And, we actually, Rich Worthington did a repair on a new Gibson, expensive Gibson acoustic that they sent, where I think it was the E, B, and G strings didn't resonate because the pickup wasn't making proper content. So I can't remember if I had to go down to, the hockey arena, whatever it was called that week, or they got it out to me. But I had to get it to Worthington, have him, do that hair, thickness adjustment to get full contact to use it to play hockey arenas around the country. So we got that done and went down there. Junior and I went and had the catered dinner with the band and hung out. And Mick Ralphs made a really complimentary remark about Junior. but also at the same time compared him to his dad's public persona. I'll put it that way. And I've never repeated what was said to him about it. But, I started laughing, and, ultimately it was one of those things that's, we've discussed it, God knows how many times over the decades of, well, if you were, I'll just use the term unpleasant, we wouldn't be friends regardless of who your dad was. Wouldn't matter. And to honor his dad, in fact, because it was, it's a big deal to the guys involved in it, or at least some of them. To honor Chuck, who had never had Chuck Berry picks done, we did two variations. Joe, I met before James Gang got bigger. I mean, they'd already had a couple of hits by the time I met him, but he sort of adopted me as his little brother, which is, a part of the issue. For me, I mean, a big part, because here was this guy, who, I loved the James Gang. They'd walk away and funk number 49K. She was playing them all the time. And Joe actually flew me to Chicago for 2.5 days, a weekend with him to deliver an old Les Paul custom. And, I'm staying there at the Lakeshore Holiday Inn, which, was where the bands like Stones and The Who would stay at the Drake back then. And I don't think there was a Water Tower Plaza yet, but Whitehall was another one that was big. I remember the Stones used to rent out like whole floors, and they'd have, guys at the stairwells so nobody could come up, and people at the elevator. And so they would literally just take over whole floors to do that. But Joe sort of adopted me as a little brother. James Gang played the Washington U Fieldhouse for my freshman orientation concert. To fast forward through that summer, when, I showed Martin Barr, the junior, whatever, like earlier mid-May of 70. And then, it would have been like first week of September that James Gang played there. And I came over in the afternoon and talked to Joe. And this was a real landmark moment that I've never heard from anybody else in all those years. They had, locker rooms upstairs at that point. This was before they were doing presidential or vice presidential debates at the field house that they, no doubt spent tens of millions of dollars redoing. But we're walking down the steps, and we're walking right behind Joe. He just turned to me and he said, well, Ed, if you hear any songs you want to learn how to play, just, tell me and I'll teach them to you. I'm a kid. I had just turned 18 2 months before that. And here's this guy, who's just this killer guitar player going, yeah, I'll teach him to you. Sure. And, he asked for a single cutaway melody maker. And I knew of one at a pawn shop downtown, and I went down and bought it for him, brought it out to the hotel. I spent the afternoon with them, and Joe offered to trade me one of his gold top Les Pauls that he had. He had 2 deluxes. And he said, well, the tour's almost over. I'll send you one of those, or, here's a check, but just hold on to the check, and I'll give you one of my gold tops that I've been using on tour. So I was stupid and cashed the check. And I remember talking to him later. He goes, well, I told you, we only had like 2 more weeks to go, and you should have taken the guitar. And I didn't like deluxes. I didn't want one, This was around the time I traded for this, and I traded a mint 68 gold top for this thing that I couldn't stand, and it said red and yellow glitter glued to the front of it. And the stripper wouldn't even take it off. I spent months scraping it as carefully as I could. And then it was like dark gray into the wood here. I mean, God knows how much of the top I took off, sanding it down to the point of being clean. But the amazing thing with a lot of the old gold tops was that they used curly maple that was, I maybe to some degree, scrap left over from the super expensive jazz guitars they were doing. And but eventually, the guy I was playing with in high school or had, and I refinished it, and the sunburst on the top was not right. It was too orange in the middle, and I don't remember, what the cherry color was, but it wasn't correct. But it's still, I actually did this by hand with a brush, at 18 years old. And it's still, the color was right and it's still tolerable. I've thought about having Tom Worthington or Tom Murphy with Gibson, pardon me, redoing it. I went, screw it, I'm leaving it as is. But I've had this one since I was 18.
Yeah.
And, but Joe, was handing out business cards to other bands. And one of the nights that I remember, because it was so much fun. Oh yeah, the deal with the Sunburst Les Paul, the coffee shop one. Joe went upstairs, came back, handed me a lunch bag for this guitar that I'd taken 2 years to get it. I knew it was Gary Richrat's first burst, so it was really significant. At least to Gary, he would become a friend by then. And he hands me this lunch bag, and I look in there, pull out this handful of paper, and I'm like, look, it's all 5s and 10s. And I just felt terrible. I was like, and I'd agreed to it. And I wrote up a receipt, which I still have, 2 copies. I've still got one laminated at home with the accountant's, name on it too. And he signed it, serial number, the whole deal. But Joe ended up, to fast forward, using that. And I didn't know for ages. I was so mad at myself because I thought, this guy, he's got all these other guitars. He's got other Sunburst Les Pauls. That guitar was so meaningful to me, and I sold it to him, and it's sitting in probably a storage locker out at Studio Instrument Rentals out in Los Angeles. And I didn't know till VH1 came on the air. And one of the first videos that I saw in there was the Eagles Long Run video. And if you see the one that hasn't been chopped up at both ends for commercials, the video starts, whoever was producing it or the photographer, head of, whoever's shooting the video, started out with a close-up of this beautiful blood red cherry Sunburst Les Paul, focused on the body, pulls back, and then shows Joe and Don Felder and Henley and Fry. And, they're playing this through that and, showing close-ups of Joe playing slide and all that. Joe was really helpful. I mean, he didn't have a little brother, so I was sort of it. But he was giving out my cards to other bands. And he was tremendously helpful. Johnny Winter, I will add, speaking of big brothers, he never, despite being over 8 years older than I was, never talked down to me, never talked to me like I was a kid. He always talked to me same level. And I sold him his first Firebird. You sort of have to either be in the blues or blues rock or an old guy to know who Johnny was. But, there was a time that Johnny, in '69, Johnny was, at least in some areas, as big as Hendrix was. One of the things that we kept trying to get through to his manager, to use the term loosely, abuser would be more like it, in his last 10 years or whatever. And I, due to legal issues, can't even go into what they did to him. And I'll just say the story about how he died is bullshit. Publicly, the manager saying, "Oh, Johnny died in his sleep in the hotel in Zurich, and he died peacefully." No, I've got emails from the guy, and got phone calls from him saying, "Oh yeah, my wife was with him, and he collapsed on the floor, and one of the guys with the road crew knew CPR, so they called him down, and he couldn't revive him, so then they called the front desk, and then they called an ambulance, and it was like 4 hours later." But I'm exaggerating, but they kept, I'll just say he died unexpectedly. About 3 weeks after my 18th birthday, Johnny always mentioned me in every TV interviews. There's stuff on YouTube that you can pull up. Whoever's doing the interview said, "Oh, well, how do you get interested in Firebirds?" And Johnny goes, "Ed Seelig brought one to me." And he goes, No, how'd you get interested in Firebirds?" He goes, "Ed Seelig from St. Louis." And the guy asked again, and he goes, "Ed from St. Louis brought one to me," and I don't remember how much he elaborated, but again, this is less than 3 weeks after my 18th birthday. I went to a festival on a farm up in Iowa, and met Johnny the first afternoon up there. Sort of like Jeff Beck, except live and in person. This guy's one of my guitar heroes, and Johnny, as I found out that afternoon, loved playing festivals, and he was there to have a good time, and we did